If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I hope you enjoy this episode. The education of a boy, wrote the Greek historian Herodotus about the Persians, will begin at the age of 5 and finish when he is 20. But in all that time, he will only ever be taught 3 things: how to ride a horse, how to fire a bow, and how to tell the truth. Well, the thesis of today's podcast is that actually the Persians taught a lot more than that. Actually, in fact, that huge amounts of today, even in the 21st century, here in the West, that we take for granted, that it derives ultimately from Persia. And remember the famous line from Monty Python's Life of Brian, what have the Romans ever done for us? Well, I had this conversation with a friend months ago, and she said, what have the Persians ever done for us? And the question, what have the Romans ever done for us, if you remember back to that crazy Monty Python film, the question is actually posed sarcastically by a member of the People's Front of Judea, criticizing Roman rule. However, it leads to an interestingly humorous kind of list of Roman contributions, which include, the aqueducts, sanitation, roads, irrigation, medicine, education, wine, public baths, public safety, via the Pax Romana. And when you ask the question of what have the Persians done for us, I could give you a very similar answer, but I need to convince you. I certainly needed to convince her. And I guess this is a thesis that may not seem immediately obvious because the Persians don't really tend to occupy the kind of outsized role that other ancient civilizations do in popular imaginings, civilizations like the Egyptians or the Greeks or the Romans. But speaking for myself, the more I've studied antiquity, the more I've written about it, the more I think about it, the more I've come to think that Persia is actually like some kind of great underground spring from which infinite numbers of rivers and streams, when you trace them back over the course of the centuries and the millennia, turn out to have sprung from. I think in the West, we tend to forget a little about Iran, and particularly, we're actually fixated in the 20th century on Russia and China, and I suppose the sort of antagonists of the West. But Iran and the Iranian Revolution of 1979 seem to me one of the great foundational moments of the contemporary era. So the rise of the Ayatollahs of radical Islam and the way in which that was exported. Iran talks of the United States as the great Satan, but in many ways, Iran has been the great Satan, hasn't it? For the secular West ever since 1979. And I think that for lots of people, if you say Iran, you tend to think of women shrouded in black veils and old men sitting on the streets with long beards, kind of wagging their fingers and saying nasty things about America and the West. And of course, the other thing that springs to mind with me is the fatwa that was put on the great Salman Rushdie. And I think also perhaps that can actually obscure the way in which Persia really is one of the truly great rich civilizations of the world. Dr. Ali Ansari, who is a professor of Iranian studies at the prestigious St. Andrews University, he's written a number of books, but 2 of them that I liked, I think, the most were Iran, Islam, and Democracy, and Iran, A Very Short Introduction, which I just finished, which was the real driving factor for this podcast. And he writes incredibly well, and he talks about this idea that essentially everything comes from Persia. And I'm sure that if he was sitting here today, he would actually be happy to go along with that. And I almost would. Basically, he thinks that their contribution to, human civilization has largely been underrated and largely ignored. And I agree. And I think the prism of looking at Iran has been really via the Islamic Revolution of 1979. It's very much colored our understanding, and it sort of permeates everything we think about Iran. Whereas in actual fact, of course, Iran and the Persians have so much more to offer. And then there is the question of Iran and Persia. When I came to do this research, the main question I had was, Are they two different things that happen to have been in the same kind of geographical location, or is there actually continuity? And you'll be happy to know that there is absolute continuity. And through this podcast, I'll hope to show that Iran and Persia are indeed the same thing, certainly in the Western record. So when we're looking at Iran, Iran is the name actually given to the country and the territory, the political territory, or even the culture, if you will, by the indigenous peoples of that region. Persia is really a sort of Greek-Roman rendition of the story and the reflection of a particular people or tribe of Iran. So, sorry, I'm just getting this right in my head. So, if you look at hierarchy, I mean, there's a rather good quote ascribed or attributed to Darius the Great, who basically says that I am an Achaemenid by family, a Persian by tribe, and an Iranian in terms of my peoples. So, there's sort of a tripartite division, which I actually think works really well. I mean, what he means by those three things, when he said that 2,500 years ago, is obviously vastly different to what we might understand today. But nonetheless, I think it offers us an insight on how those relate. And I think far too many people, Western historians, for instance, confuse the fact. They think that Persia is a different place to Iran and that Iran was invented in the 20th century. It wasn't. And you know what? Most Iranians would be horrified to even hear that. And most travelers, actually, most Western travelers who went to Iran in the modern period, say from the 17th century onwards, all recognize this. I mean, they all say this in their texts, in their diaries, in their letters that they wrote home. What they say is the people who we call the Persians actually call themselves Iranians. So I think that's very, very clear. And I think for the avoidance of doubt, before we go forward to my top 10 hits, if you like, I should also make it clear that the term Iranian has nothing to do with the 19th century European racial connotation of Aryans and all that kind of thing. It just doesn't. It's basically a linguistic distinction, a linguistic definition that comes out and is basically applied. I think for many Iranians, in a sort of historical basis, Iran simply meant as the Franks do. Basically, noble born, free born, and that sort of thing. So it's nothing. It's really little more than that. On that note, let me quote something from the great scholar of Iran, Mr. Ben Affleck. That's right. Ben says, Persia is very different from the Arab Middle East in terms of architecture and language, even though we think of them as one big Middle Eastern area. In truth, Persia is quite distinct. I think I found my historical level. But let's just tease that out, because as well as Persia, Iran, or whatever we call it, is this great upland plateau. You've got the Zagros Mountains, and then you go down the Zagros Mountains, and you're into the kind of flatlands of Iraq and Mesopotamia. And historically, if you look at the Iranian or the Iranian peoples as we described as a linguistic grouping, I mean, obviously they have a distinct Iranian language affiliated to, I think, an Indo-European heritage, which means that actually the language, the Persian language, not to confuse matters, but the Persian language spoken by the Iranians is basically much, much closer to the European languages that we actually speak. And what you see in their language is the sort of, father, brother, mother, sister. So it's actually quite interesting in terms of that linguistic distinction. And of course, the Iranians occupying and having three major imperial empires prior to the rise of the Arab Muslim caliphates of the 7th century meant that they had a certain presence in the Middle East long before the Arabs did. So basically, if you look at, to give us, I guess, some sort of kind of chronological parameters, we have the First Persian Empire, which actually is the empire that most people in the West would be familiar with, which is the Achaemenid Persian Empire, which is the one that covers everything from Greece over the Indus down to Egypt and, so on and so forth. These are the guys who actually lose at the Battle of Marathon in Greece. So, we're talking about figures like Cyrus the Great, Darius, Xerxes, all the people that we know from our biblical and classical experiences, or from the movies, the 300, who really kind of brought these guys back to life. And we'll talk a little bit more about them later on. And of course, the quote that I gave from Herodotus earlier, I have to remind you that technically Herodotus is a Persian subject. He is the father of history. That I have no doubt. So what we're looking at here is the First Empire, and that empire lasts for about 200 years and is basically overthrown by no less than Alexander the Great. And we can also talk a little bit about Alexander, the legacy of the Persian world. And believe me, it's not all positive. You won't be surprised to know. And then subsequent to a sort of Hellenic interlude, you then get the rise of a new dynasty, which in Western lingo we know as the Parthians. And of course, the Parthians are actually the longest standing of the dynasties, the longer lasting of the dynasties. They're quite decentralized and they occupy much of the Iranian plateau. And it's with the Parthians that you get the first sort of contest with the Romans and the Roman Republic. And of course, after that, then the Roman Empire, subsequently. The Parthians last from about, I'd argue, probably 250 BC to 250 AD. And then they are subsequently succeeded by probably the most influential of the pre-Islamic Persian empires, certainly as far as Iran is concerned, and that is the Sassanians. And the Sasanian dynasty claims a much, much longer heritage on the plateau and lasts really until the mid-7th century, until they are overthrown by the Arab Muslim armies. But it's the Sassanians that really set the scene far more than the previous two dynasties in actual fact. They're the ones that compile a sort of historical record. They're the ones that actually give the name Iran to that political territory. And if I was to say my first, if I can put it that way, is that there is a suggestion, which I'm actually sort of happy to accept based on the research that I've done, that, and not entirely uncritically, but certainly accept, is that Iran is one of, if not the first, territorially defined political unit that has a degree of continuity to it from the period of antiquity to the present day. So the Iran that is set up by the Sassanians, the empire of Iran, is basically the sort of cultural territory, if not entirely the political territory, because obviously it was much bigger. It was much bigger than the Iran that we actually have of today. And what I'm saying, I guess what I'm trying to say to you is that Iran is actually the first country ever. Now, that's something to think about. Iran, as far as the Iranians are concerned in historical places, is the first kingdom. I mean, it's actually the first dominion of man over nature. But that's largely part of the mythical heritage, right? But it's definitely one that Iranian nationalists are very, very keen to promote. And of course, some of the chronology goes really quite far back and is quite wholly kind of unrealistic. There are Iranian historians who are saying that it's not just, 2,500 years. Let's take it back further. And of course, you can sit down with a number of, Iranian historians and you can extend it back as far as you actually like. And there's a very famous account. I can't remember the guy's name, actually, in the earlier 20th century when a nationalist historiographer, he was so entertaining. He actually calculated that the length of the kingdom of Iran, going back through the mythical great epic poem of Iran, the Book of Kings, and what he calculated from that was that the length of the kingdom could actually be traced back 10 billion years. And of course, then someone else pointed out that this actually predated the creation of the world. And of course, that definitely puts the Romans in their place, doesn't it? I mean, if you accept that, then everything does begin in Iran, obviously. But what complicates the picture in terms of the country, because clearly there is this incredible sense of continuity. I mean, the last Shah of Iran famously had, great celebrations of the great Kai-manded capital. And, this is in 1979, and he jetted over cooks from Paris, and it was a massive extravaganza. And then, of course, we know what happened to him. And I suppose what complicates this picture of continuity is that the Sasanian Empire of the 7th century collapses before the Arabs and before they introduce Islam. And then the question begs, to what extent is Islam a radical rupture? And to what extent does Iranian culture come to an accommodation, I guess, with Islam? And is there a genuine sense of that continuity? Well, I mean, my favorite phrase in all of this is to say, and I don't know where it came from, but I wish I could. I wish I could claim it as mine, but it's not. And the phrase is, a captive Persia took prisoner her conquerors. And if you just think about that for a second, but it's essentially the notion that there have been a series of ruptures in Iranian history. Clearly from Alexander the Great all the way through to, the Arabs in the 7th century and obviously, the Muslim conquest. It's a very serious, almost, psychological, ideological rupture, obviously, in bringing in a new religion, a new calendar, and so on and so forth. But then also you have the Mongol invasions of the 13th century that are particularly devastating on a socioeconomic level. But in all these cases, I mean, you'll find this sort of cultural confidence in the Persians. And I'll use those terms, Iranians and Persians, kind of interchangeably now in order to really kind of confuse you. No, not really. Just remember, Persians and Iranians are one and the same. But that sort of Persian cultural confidence comes through. And with the Arabs, what you find is that the Iranians basically take Islam and turn it from what is essentially an Arab religion into a global universal religion in which, non-Arabs are equally valid and therefore Persian. So you could say that Islam is actually Persian. But that would kind of be pushing it a bit too far, to be perfectly honest. There are a number of people in Iran who would certainly claim that the Islam that you see today in terms of a global universalist religion is really something that has been de-Arabized and re-Persianized. I mean, why quibble? But it's, that's certainly one of the views. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily, I have to say, subscribe to that, but it's obviously a religion adhered to by all. And that's the argument. Of course, you see it with Shiaism as well, but you also see it with the Mongols. Iran is the only part of the Mongol Empire that basically absorbed the Mongols within Persian culture. In China, for instance, they expelled the Mongols, but the Iranians somehow just absorbed them. And you still see lots of traces of the Mongol and Turkic conquests in Iran if you were to go there today. Now, sitting in front of me, I've got a list of everything that I think Persia basically invented, for which, if true, we should be getting down on our knees and groveling before the Persians because they did so much. But maybe I've gone too far. I just think that there are a number of, the one thing that I think you should really acknowledge is that basically Persia is the midwife to the West, isn't it? There would be no West without the Persians. So, and think about that. So on that theme, I've prepared a list of 10 things that the Persians have given the world. I have to say, I felt very restricted by 10, but it is only one podcast. Anyway, I'm now going to try and rattle these off and explain them to you. So let's start with Persia being the first kingdom. And basically, I will elicit here the support of that great German philosopher Hegel to remind us that history begins with the Persians. So our understanding of history as a progressive movement, in a sense of enlightenment, if you will, really begins with the Persians. But I think, this idea of Iran as the first kingdom, the first dominion of man over nature, the first place, I think, where history begins effectively. And this territorially delimited state, which is also the midwife, in a sense, to an ancient sense, to the concept of the West. And I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but again, just give that some thought. Pause and think about what I've just said. So, what's really interesting is that we don't have this notion of Persia as a great civilization in the same way that we have with the Romans and the Greeks, and even actually the Babylonians or the Egyptians, to be honest. We don't. But nonetheless, I think Persia sits in the background as the kind of best supporting actor. And what I think I'd like to do is move Persia from best supporting actor to really kind of center stage. I think Persia should be getting the best actor award, frankly. And I then wondered, because this is the way my mind works, if it all kind of kicked off with Cyrus the Great. Was he the person who basically created Persia? And depending on who you talk to, I think the answer is yes. I think in the popular understanding, the father of the nation, of the Persian nation, is Cyrus the Great, who basically binds the Medes and the Persians together into the first of these Iranian empires. And the Persian Empire, from say 559 BC to when would it be? I guess about 333 BC. That's the first of the Persian empires, which basically establishes, and I would add to that, the first universal empire. I think the Persians are the first people who formulate their imperial rule as something completely universal and indeed moral, so that it actually reflects the kind of patterning of the universe. But let's just play devil's advocate, because nothing is ever that easy in history. It just isn't. So Cyrus the Great, his fame is immense. He's famous because he is hugely praised by two people who he conquers. One of them is the Greeks, and the Greeks think he is actually the model of a great man. And the other, of course, is actually the Jews. And the Jews in their Bible say that he's the Messiah, that he's the anointed one, praised by such by Isaiah. But all we really have from the Persians is a kind of a tomb inscription. In what sense, then, are the Persians inventing history when they're not actually writing it down in the way that the Greeks and the Jews are? I think the main thing is that we have to understand is that one of the contributions to history that I think the Persians make is if you understand the way in which history is written, because there are mythological narratives and what we might call historical narratives. The Iranians certainly after the Hellenic period and into the Parthians and the Sasanian period tend to sort of write a history that is largely mythologically based. I mean, they derive a mythological narrative of their descent. And the interesting thing with that is that certainly the Achaemenids tend to sort of get erased from that history in a very detailed sense. But they do exist in the mythological narratives. They are there. And the figure of Kurosh, which is Persian for Cyrus, does appear in a number of these mythological narratives. So there is a historical narrative. It's just not a historical narrative that we would recognize, but it's a very profound historical narrative that is more mythological, in a sense, in its construction and full of folklore than the history which we would have in terms of the discipline that we would actually understand it. And of course, that we would collectively understand it. But I think it's just a different type of history. So some of the things on my list, the things that I think are Persian. Okay, so I've mentioned about the Persian contribution to Islam, that they basically made that universal. But I think the Persian contributions to other religions have also been pretty impressive, certainly through Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism was the pre-Islamic religion of Persia or Iran. And Zoroastrianism actually provided a number of ideas. I mean, some fairly sort of simple things that we take for granted today, of course, which is how effective it's actually been. This notion of the end of times, for instance, and a spiritual redeemer, these are Zoroastrian beliefs, and they're sort of bound in with that sort of Judaic heritage that sort of then comes through in Christianity. Because we should say that the people of Judah, of Jerusalem, they get taken prisoner by the Babylonians and they get taken to Babylon and they walk through the rivers of Babylon weeping. This is all recorded. So the Jews are in captivity in Babylon and then they're basically released. And then Cyrus actually lets them come back, which is why the Jews love the Persians. And they do. And they come back with distinctly Persian ideas. So the question I then had was, is Judaism Persian then? Let's not exaggerate to diminish the effectiveness of this argument. I can do that very well. I think the interesting thing is that if you look at the two biblical texts, I think it's the book of Daniel actually, and the book of Revelation, they actually carry some fairly strong Zoroastrian tropes and ideas in there. They do. I mean, obviously, these are things that historians and scholars far brighter than me will be dissecting and interrogating, when they go looking for these texts. But if you look at once the Jews returned from the Babylonians in captivity, and of course, the main point is there's a lot of them that didn't. A lot of them actually stayed in Mesopotamia because they loved it so much, which is the heartland of, the sort of Persian Empire. and imbued a lot of these ideas. But you can see Zoroastrian ideas coming through. And there's even parts of the text where they sort of say there are words that are being used that are clearly Persian. And there's a great concept in, I guess, the part of Zoroastrian theology, which is concerned with, death, judgment, and the final destiny of the soul and humankind, of a sort of a dragon king in the end of days. And although the end of days has a certain circularity to it, there is a great dragon king that is then overthrown, and then you have peace and justice as one would hope for. And the Dragon King, in the way that it's described in Zoroastrian texts, as I translate it, has strong similarities, I should say, with the beast in the book of Revelation. And that's really interesting. Now, again, none of these are definitive, but I think it does make for quite a strong case that there's a huge connection. I mean, one of the things that I think the Persians have been extremely good at exporting, if I may say so, is religion and religious ideas. They're experts at it. And the whole idea of the world being divided. I mean, even Herodotus saying that the Persians get taught truth. And of course, the counterpoint to truth is the lie. So the world divided into good and evil. Darkness is obviously hugely strong in the Bible. So I think we could chalk up by this stage that the Persians have actually invented empire, the first empire, history, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So that's not that bad. Let's leave it at that, and we'll take a short break. And when we come back, I'll have more for you. Orthodomus is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Orthodomus, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Orthodomus or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. Okay, so welcome back. And in case you've just joined, I'm in the process of telling the world that the Persians basically invented everything. Well, I think the other thing I think is very important is that the Persians invented paradise. But I suppose that needs a bit of a qualification here as well. And really, paradise in the old texts is the idea of a walled garden, a planned and structured garden. And this is something that's very closely associated actually with the figure of Cyrus the Great, whom archaeologists have actually discovered had a rather spectacular walled garden at his capital in Pasadago in southern Iran. And of course, this Persian afflection, shall we say, for the natural world. And I'm going to make a claim here, actually, that they're really the original environmentalists, by the way. So you can see where I'm actually going. They're the original Green Party. And I think we can safely say that now started in Persia or in Iran. But this sort of affection for the natural world, gardens and the sort of order and beauty of the natural world, I think is something that's very closely associated with the Persians throughout history, actually. And one that, you will even find, European commentators and other commenting on through history. There's a lovely, lovely narrative that I've read, and I can't remember where it comes from, but something says Xenophon, where a Spartan king goes to visit Cyrus the Younger in his palace, the governor's palace in Sardis, and comments very generously about the splendid nature of his garden and says, you must congratulate your slaves for having done so much incredible work. It looks absolutely beautiful. And of course, Cyrus the Younger laughs and says, no, I've done this by my own hand. And the Spartan king is rather shocked at this, because they don't sully their hands in gardens. But Cyrus then says to him, I always feel it very important that until one has labored with one's own hands, one should not sit down for a meal. That's actually just one of the, the wonderful, wonderful things about the Persian Empire is that the way that the kings are actually portrayed as great gardeners. And that's the role they play. And, really interestingly, I just remembered this. One of the great ways in which Xerxes is actually encouraged to invade Greece, again, remind you, Xerxes is the king that the 300 kind of fought against, the 300 Spartans fought against with the Athenians. One of the reasons he was encouraged to invade is because someone said to him, there's some amazing trees and plants there. And when you think about that, you imagine this great Persian king going, well, it's a bit of a garden center, isn't it? Well, let's just invade. He's thinking about his gardens while all this is taking place. And look, in truth, I've never been to Iran. I was invited in 1979 by a school friend of mine, and I never went, and I wish I had of. So I think probably a lot of our listeners wouldn't have been to Iran either. So my perception, which may be completely and utterly false, is that Iran is quite a sort of dusty, hot place. I just imagine deserts. So I then wondered, the paradise that we talk about with walled gardens, is that actually a refuge just from the heat? And does it have to be created by man? Or am I completely wrong? And is Persia actually much more greener and much more verdant? Because, of course, in the ancient period, the argument is that southern Iran was much more verdant than what we see there today. And I think because of the sparseness of the landscape, the Iranians developed, vast irrigation networks and plans for, water supply to be taken throughout the land. I mean, they were very, very skilled at that, and therefore developed, I suppose, these kind of walled gardens as a refuge. There is this sort of Orientalist view of the Middle East as being all deserts and camels. I mean, we were taught this at schools, in the old texts and books that we read, that there are deserts in Iran, obviously, but there are also jungles in Iran, and I didn't know that. I mean, if you go up to the Caspian and the northern areas, it's very verdant. So, there's a whole range of different sort of climate times, but certainly in the south, and I think this sort of idea, the affection for a garden is that you harness nature to provide a refuge, really in an otherwise rather sort of bleak landscape in some way. So I think they invented the garden and the paradise for those particular areas. I do also remember reading a really detailed account about Isfahan, and I'm trying to remember the book. Golly, what's it called? The Physician. Oh my gosh, if you haven't read it, it's such a good book, and it takes you back. It's historical fiction, but it actually takes you back to the 13th century, so just after the invasion of the Mongols. Actually, I lie, probably back to the 15th century, so after the Mongols have kind of come and gone. But anyway, I digress. I remember reading a detailed account about Isfahan, and they said that it was oven hot. And yet, when you went into a garden that had been created, it was incredibly cool. And there were fountains, and the synthesis of, vegetation with the architecture was so breathtakingly beautiful. And I kept thinking, these places are as beautiful as any I've ever read about. And you can see why the idea of these walled gardens are kind of places where God would have actually walked and talked to man. So you can see where they come from. You can entirely see where that whole notion of God talking to man would have come from. You can also see this notion of, the Garden of Eden, of course. I mean, it's this idea of a walled garden and paradise on earth. It's a reflection of that. The way it's been designed is to bring a measure of comfort with coolness of with the water. The water is there to give you that sense of a little refuge away from the troubles of the world. So with that, I think we should also clock up gardening to the Persians. And also the origins of environmental thinking. I think that's important. And of course, the word paradise is a Persian word. And the Greeks then took it, and somehow we ended up getting that in the West. So there you go. Gardens, let's chalk up another one for the Persians. So let's now move a little bit to leisure and sport. Now, I'd actually like to think that the Persians invented cricket, but I have absolutely no evidence of that whatsoever. And of course, there are arguments about polo, of course. I mean, polo is very prominent in Persia, and I think it's prominent because of all the horse training that it actually gives. Horses are actually a big deal for the Persians. I mean, the horses are very important to the way they live and the way they war. But I will venture to say that I also think that the Persians invented the stirrup, for instance. It's a really controversial debate, and I know I'm going to get messages and emails about this, but I think that they did. And people will argue that the Franks did it and also the Carolingians. However, there has been a suggestion that it was the Persians who actually invented it. But I don't want to go into that in detail because I think it could get me into a lot of trouble. However, the Sasanian and the Parthians actually developed very heavily armored, mounted soldiers. I guess the term that we would use is knights. And when you see the sketches, they look like knights of old. And of course, the argument then is, or the question is, how did these heavily armored knights with their lances, how did they sit upright and stay on their horses if they didn't have stirrups? In the sense of their charging, you see these wonderful sorts of friezes in southern Iran of knights, sort of basically jousting with each other. Now, the argument is, and I talked to a number of colleagues about this, and they say, but they have these small rigid saddles which they sat in, and that's what kept them upright. And I'm kind of thinking, well, maybe. And I know there's also a discussion and an argument that actually the stirrup came from Central Asia, through to Iran, and the Iranians sort of operationalized it. So, and maybe they did, but I'm going to stick at this stage until I see more evidence that the Persians invented the stirrups and knights and tournaments and therefore chivalry. And just to change the subject before I lose it completely, I think the Iranians are also basically the founders of backgammon. Now, you'll hear people say that the Iranians are the founders of chess, and a lot of terms for chess actually come from India. I think chess actually did come from India. So I'm not going to give the Persians chess, but they certainly developed a lot of the wording for chess. I mean, what I would say is that the Iranians probably refined the rules and made chess workable. And I know I'll get a lot of emails on that as well from my Indian listeners for saying that. But nonetheless, they certainly invented backgammon. I don't think chess can be claimed. And in terms of leisure and foodstuffs, I'm actually going to make a bid for spaghetti. I know. And I just had this discussion with a very close friend of mine who argued the same thing. She'd actually read the same historical reports. And of course, this comes from the discussion that Marco Polo never really got to China. I actually don't think he did. And I think the noodles actually came to Persia from the Mongol Empire invasion of the 13th century. I think that's how they actually got through to Iran. The Iranians actually refined them, as they always do. The Iranians or the Persians are always making things better by and large. And then Marco Polo took that spaghetti back with him to northern Italy when he returned. So that's an interesting kind of longer argument. But I'm actually quite taken by that one based on the evidence that I've seen. Just going back, something else just occurred to me. Just going back to the knights for a second. Sorry, this has been, playing on my mind. If the Persians were so great and they had these fantastic saddles, then how did they actually lose to Alexander the Great? And then it came to me, there's actually two things there. Those knights were actually developed after Alexander the Great. So that's one. But the second one, and the main reason why the Iranian states collapse, is political rather than militarily. It's basically divisions of command. They were all very busy backstabbing each other. It was all very political. And the other thing, just on that note, that the Persians do very well is decadence. But decadence is actually, it's pretty good there all the way through history. And maybe just thinking about this, if I'd want to be known for anything, it would be decadence and depravity. I don't know. Gibbon, the historian, has this wonderful notion about, because they struggled how to categorize the Persians, they didn't want to put them in the category of barbarians because they weren't. So they said, well, they're civilized, really. They're part of our civilized world. And you see that a lot in the 18th century European depictions. But Gibbon sort of basically develops this notion that the reason why the Persians aren't doing as well as they might be doing is because actually they've become over-civilized. There's too much decadence. They've effectively done civilization to the nth degree, and therefore they become too decadent. And I think that's great. And I mean, that's sort of the Orientalist argument, isn't it? You can actually imagine them just sitting there drinking sherbet and strolling in their their paradisic gardens. I don't even know whether paradisic is a word, but they're gardens of paradise. But it's also quite a nice idea that, that they are so good at civilization that they just overdid it. I mean, whoever does that? Anyway, so there's a couple of other things that I would like to say, and this is tied with the cavalry notion. The high heel, which actually was news to me, when I started this research. And that's actually pretty decadent when you think about it. And there's a couple of fashion things that I would like to say. So in the 17th century, if you look at the changes in fashion in Europe between the early and the latter part of the 17th century, and this is the point when early modern European travelers were going to Iran, much, much more often, they come back with fashion tips. And a number of them, if you see, just look at pictures of Charles II and the other nobles of the time. They all wear these rather extravagant high heels. And the reason for the high heel was basically to be able to sort of sit comfortably in the saddle with your foot in a stirrup. So not actually to look taller. That being said, with high heels, the Persians did look taller and the Europeans liked it. The other fashion item, which I think I can trace fairly easily to, even someone like John Evelyn's diaries in the 17th century, is the adoption of the Persian coat, which was taken and absorbed by Louis XIV's court, and then, of course, adopted by other European courts in Europe. The Persian coat, that's ultimately the jacket that we all wear these days, the jacket that you would wear on a suit. So basically, it's a jacket that has lapels. So the Persians have invented the suit. I mean, the trouser is actually a Persian item of clothing. And of course, when the Greeks invaded and attacked, they think that what the Persians are wearing is hilarious. The brilliant thing about the Greeks is that they thought the Persians were hilariously effeminate because they wore trousers rather than skirts and togas. So these sort of items of clothing that obviously the Europeans have taken and made into their own, frankly, I think we should be very grateful to the Persians for inventing them. I talked about India a lot in my other podcasts, and obviously I mentioned India in this podcast in relation to chess. And I could float another topic, perhaps to add to the top 10, which is the British Raj. So the British Raj is actually hugely Persian, because one of the things that I came across when I was researching for this podcast was Lord Curzon. He actually made a trip to Persia and went to Persepolis, and he admired it hugely. And he actually left his graffiti there, as, grand British travelers were tempted to do. In fact, you can still see it today. And of course, in due course, he then became Viceroy of India and was a tremendous enthusiast for Persian style, court flummery. So I think there's a case for saying that actually the British like to think that they were all learning Greek, in their boarding schools and things, but actually the British in India were much more Persian than they were to Greek. So the British take over the administration from the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire, the administration of the Mughal Empire is actually basically based on Persian models. And actually, the language is Persian. If you were to go to an Indian civil service, certainly all the way up to 1857, you had to speak Persian. Persian is the language of the administration. And it's very striking, actually. And it hints also to, why Britain and Iran have had such a very close, interesting relationship over the millennia. Because in many ways, Britain was in charge, for 100 years or so, of at least one half of the Persianate world, if I can put it that way. Now, we derive a lot of things from there, and I would like to make a claim that the modern civil service, as derived from the Indian civil service, actually borrowed a lot of ideas and a lot of attitudes from the old traditional Persian administrations. And one of my favorite terms in all of this is the idea of purdah. When we go into politics, the civil service of purdah. Well, purdah is actually a Persian word. and it means curtain or the veil. So basically, when you go to vote, when elections start, the civil service goes behind the veil. It goes into purdah. And this is a term directly derived, obviously from the experience in British India and the Persianate world. And I think there's a strong case to be made that many of the ideas of the civil service and its administration that they developed as part of the East India Company, obviously, and then it was driven and derived in the 19th century into the British civil service as those civil servants started to go back to the United Kingdom. So, is the British civil service Persian as well? Maybe not, but it certainly has deep roots there, I think. Okay, folks, well, we are out of time. And of course, just finishing on that, time is actually a Persian idea as well, isn't it? I might actually do a podcast on time. I quite fancy it. And of course, to finish, we can't forget things like algebra, which is also a Persian invention. Folks, thanks for listening in, and I'll look forward to chatting to you next time. Bye for now.